Hashtag arrest Fauci is trending on Twitter. Again, it's trended several times, this time over images of particularly gruesome animal experimentation. Images of dogs with their heads in boxes, and the boxes are full of infected sandflies. There's some graphic warning before I talk about the full details of what the tests ended up, what they did and what they were doing. Just want to give you that warning. I think animal testing is bad for the most part, but I'm not 100% opposed to it. However, the questions around this particular story is why were they engaged in this experiment? Now that you've been warned about the graphic nature of this, I'm not going to show any photos or anything, but let me just explain. The dogs had their vocal cords slit so that they couldn't whimper or cry. Their heads were placed in boxes that were full of infected sandflies that proceeded to eat their faces alive. Many people were wondering why this had to be done. Now, I think this is bad, and I think it's wrong, and I think there's gruesome studies carried out on these animals, and I would prefer maybe a slightly slower rate of scientific progress in exchange for better ethical guidelines. We know these horrifying stories about that Unit 7, whatever, the Japanese scientific unit, and what the Nazi scientists were doing. They did brutal stuff in Japan. There was, I think it was Operation Paperclip, I'm not sure, where we started recruiting all of these scientists that were doing awful things in these foreign countries. But for one example, in Japan, they would take a prisoner and they would stick their arm out into freezing cold and freeze it to see what would happen to the living person on the inside. And I'm pretty sure they would shatter it in certain instances, like break it off just to see what would happen. I mean, absolutely brutal stuff. So, of course, seeing these photos, people are calling for Fauci's arrest. I'm actually going to offer up a slight defense of Fauci. I know the dude doesn't really deserve it for the most part for a lot of reasons, but it's not so much about Fauci, it's about scientific research. It's about this idea that people will expect wealth and splendor without sacrifice. I'm reminded of the anime Full Metal Alchemist. Let me nerd out. Equivalent exchange. You must give something to get something. I think about all the iPhones and smartphones people have, and they celebrate the great technology without realizing all of the backbreaking labor, slavery, and the suicides around, say, iPhones, for instance. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine. I've maybe told you the story before, where she was saying she wanted to make the world a better place. I said, yeah, for you and for your country and for your tribe. And she's like, no, for everybody. And I'm like, you're using a MacBook. The people who made that were performing near ritual suicide, walking off a building in single file lines because of the torture conditions they were living under. How is buying a MacBook contributing to the greater of society? And then you get these dumb memes on the left where it's like, I live in society, you know that stupid one where the guy's like, the peasant is carrying the sticks and he's like, we should improve society somewhat. And the guy says, yet you participate in it. How strange. That's a stupid argument. It's like a child's argument. You complain about how bad the world is, but then actively fund the bad parts of it because I'm more effective. Please, every despot has had everything the same. And that's why I am mostly opposed to animal research. But what I mean to say is, you want your medicines to work? Okay. We can choose to do experiments on humans, or we can choose to do it on animals. And we have varying degrees of the experimentation, from lab mice and rats to dogs and cats, because we want bigger and smaller and different animals to test on to see how things happen. And that means through this experimentation, and not all of it, you end up with things of comfort. You end up with medications that can cure you, make you less sick, heal your wounds, treat your mind. And it's because we tested it on something. Now, there's also an option that people could be willing participants and choose on a consent form saying they will accept, these medical tests, and then early stages might kill people. So there's very serious challenges. Animal testing is a part of the scientific process. I'm not saying it's good. Here's the story from stardem.com. Fauci pressed over U.S. funding of cruel medical experiments on dogs and puppies. Beagles locked in cages with sandflies, vocal cords removed. Federal lawmakers are seeking answers from Dr. Anthony Fauci regarding potential U.S. funding for medical research involving cruel treatment of dogs, including puppies, locking beagles in with sandflies and removal of vocal cords to quiet their barking. Oh, because when they were suffering, they had to remove their ability to make noise. Nancy Mace, spearheaded a letter with other Republican and Democratic congressional members asking Fauci and the NIAID about reports from watchdog groups. Fauci is the director of the NIAID. Quote, according to documents obtained via a Freedom of Information Act request by taxpayer watchdog group White Coat Waste Project and subsequent media coverage, from October 2018 until February 2019, NIAID spent $1.68 million in taxpayer funds on drug tests involving 44 beagle puppies. The dogs were all between 6 and 8 months old. The commission test involved injecting and force-feeding the puppies an experimental drug for several weeks before killing and dissecting them. The letter from Mace the letter read from Mace and 23 other lawmakers. Animal rights and other advocates also worry about reports that beagles and other dogs in the medical experiments had their vocal cords removed to quiet their barking and yelping. Quote, of particular concern is the fact that the invoice to NIAID included a line item for cordectomy. As you are likely aware, cordectomy is also known as a devocalization, involves slitting a dog's vocal cords in order to prevent them from barking, howling, or crying. The letter reads in reference to concerns about the debarking of dogs. The congressional correspondence was signed by other Republicans, including Carlos Jimenez, Daniel Webster, Brian Mast, Bill Posey, Scott Franklin, and Maria Salazar, as well as Democrats such as Cindy Axne of Ohio, Jimmy Gomez of California, and Eleanor Holmes Norton of D.C. U.S. funding of medical research involving potentially cruel treatment of dogs, in particular beagles, is being scrutinized by watchdog groups such as the White Coat Waste Project. One of the projects criticized the group's $375,800 U.S. medical research grant from NIAID to a lab in Tunisia that allegedly involved locking beagles' heads in mesh cages filled with hundreds of infected sandflies. There were also reports of researchers removing dogs' vocal cords. Okay, so you get the point. And for this, Arrest Fauci is trending. Fox News reports Twitter users posted the hashtag calling out Fauci, director of the NIAID, we get it, over reports of hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars used to subject dogs to cruel tests. Then you have these meme photos. This is why I use Stardem first instead of Fox, because Fox just shows a bunch of people tweeting about it instead of core details. BDW tweeted, if you're angry about how Fauci uses puppies, just wait until you hear about he uses COVID vaccines on healthy kids. All right. Arrest Fauci is trending. He funded, first word says, he funded gain of function and he funded cruel treatment of innocent dogs. He's an evil doctor and a despicable person. I'd agree with that. Additionally, Fauci has been criticized after an NIH official appeared to confirm that taxpayers funded gain of function research on the coronavirus in a lab in Wuhan, despite Fauci's repeated claims that was not the case. In July, Republican Senator Rand Paul called for the Department of Justice to issue a criminal referral against Fauci for lying to Congress about gain of function research funded by the NIH. I will be sending a letter to the Department of Justice asking for a criminal referral because he has lied to Congress. We have scientists that were lined up by the dozens to say that the research he was funding was gain of function, Rand Paul told Hannity. He's doing this because he has a self-interest to cover his tracks and to cover his connection to the Wuhan lab. Fauci's NIH told Fox News this week that Fauci had been entirely truthful during his testimony on gain of function research. He hasn't. He lied, and people are lying to cover his tracks. And now people are starting to dig into what else he was funding. I think it's a good thing. I think for too long, people like Fauci and special interests are able to do horrifying things because people don't pay attention. Interestingly, the story about these beagles and what goes on with them, it's been around for some time. Animal testing has been frowned upon for some time. But as I mentioned earlier, there's some very serious considerations here. We don't like the idea that dogs are being tested on, but there may be reasons to test on dogs. Maybe a certain protein metabolization. So we say we have to use dogs for this one. And I think people don't realize this. Maybe now people are starting to realize this and things could change, maybe for the better. Maybe there are better ways to go about doing these tests to secure medications for humans. Here's what I think. I think that many of these companies choose the cheaper route. They could go a safer route. They could go a more ethical route, but that would be expensive. And so what they do is they say, just cram a beagle's head in a box and see what happens. Instead of actually having decent parameters and saying, we're going to try and avoid mutilating animals and cutting them apart. And these stories are absolutely brutal. I was reading about what they do to these dogs, man. Absolutely brutal. But so long as no one is paying attention, they get away with this evil stuff. And for the longest time, people weren't paying attention. Now, I do think it's funny that we have this story from The Intercept, Bred to Suffer, Inside the Barbaric U.S. Industry of Dog Experimentation, by Glenn Greenwald and Leighton Akio Woodhouse from 2018. As you know, Glenn Greenwald is no longer at The Intercept, is very critical of it. But I find a few things fascinating. The story's been around for a long time. Glenn Greenwald covered it. He runs a dog rescue in Brazil. I believe he still does. I know he did. Been around for a long time. Why now are people all of a sudden concerned about these dogs? Could it be political? Yep. I'm willing to bet it's almost entirely political. Not for everybody, obviously. People knew about these experimentations and didn't like it. There's a lot of people now probably only are mad about it because it's Fauci and people hate Fauci. But you know what? I got no problem with that. Welcome to the fight. Welcome to the fray. If you're now going to stand up and say, hey, maybe this is wrong, maybe now you're paying attention, I think it's a good thing. Hopefully it's on principle and not tribalism. But for the time being, if we can actually address how horrifying this process is. I want to tell you exactly what Fauci was funding. I want to read for you a story from Glenn Greenwald in The Intercept, not a right-wing publication, so you can understand what Fauci was saying yes to. The Intercept reports, there is a largely hidden, poorly regulated, and highly profitable industry in the U.S. that has a gruesome function, breeding dogs for the sole purpose of often torturous experimentation, after which the dogs are killed because they are no longer of use. Americans frequently express horror at festivals in countries such as China and South Korea where dogs are killed, cooked, and eaten. Mainstream media outlets in the U.S. routinely report with a tone of disgust on the use of dogs in those countries for food consumption. And now I want to make that other point. Why just dogs? Why not any other animal? And I genuinely mean it. Now, I understand maybe there's a cultural and social aspect to this, why we care more about dogs being experimented on than, say, cows or whatever. We don't mind eating cows and chickens or pigs. We treat them like just stock, food. Well, I'll tell you this. I got a bunch of chickens. You guys know I have a bunch of chickens. I can look out the window and see Chicken City is underway, nearing completion, hopefully today or the next couple of days. And I care about my chickens, especially the babies. Now, look, we got a bunch of babies that were already born. We raised them, and I care about them. But I got to be honest. I care about the dogs and the cats that are here way more than the chickens. Now, the chickens that we actually bred and raised ourselves, I care a whole lot about. They're like my pets. And you know what? When they're old enough to lay eggs, we will eat them. I don't think we're ever going to eat these chickens because they're layers. You know, they lay eggs. So for the first few years, totally fine. We don't want to eat them. Maybe afterwards we will, because otherwise, what do? You know, they just mill about and do chicken stuff, and then that's when you eat them. Maybe we won't for some of them. I don't know. Maybe because we're doing the show. Some people have tweeted, at me like, don't eat the chickens, they're your friends. And it's like, well, so long as they're laying eggs, there's a reason to have them around. And we like them because we put them on camera and they do chicken stuff. But I think people need to realize, too, that, humans and dogs, the theory is, evolved together. And so we have a very serious bond. It's a fascinating story, by the way, which I will tell you. I'm not saying it's true. I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but my understanding is that humans had camps, nomadic, a long time ago. And they were wolves. When humans would move their camp, they'd leave behind refuse, which the wolves would come and scavenge. Eventually, some wolves were less afraid of the people. Those that were less afraid were more likely to survive. And if they were more likely to survive, there'd be more of them. And then of that new batch of wolves that were less afraid of humans would be even more babies. Now, here's the thing. Humans don't like wolves. So the humans who were more likely to tolerate the encroachment of the wolves were also more likely to survive. Why? Well, as it goes, the wolves that were closer to the camp would be marking their territory, something that humans don't care about. But other predators do. They would smell the wolf urine. They'd be like, I ain't going anywhere near here. This is wolf territory. And so eventually the wolves and the humans that were more tolerant of each other started to live closer and closer together, to the point where wolves would freely walk the camps of some of these human tribal, of these human tribes. By then, I think they were called proto-dogs. They were much more tolerant. Humans were very tolerant of them and got along with them. And then these proto-dogs would start following, or maybe it was the wolves at this point, but like proto-dogs, kind of wolf, would follow humans on the hunt. And the humans would be like, hey, This thing knows where the animal is. It can smell it. Together, humans and dogs were able to hunt prey neither could do alone. Humans and wolves. And so over time, we became somewhat symbiotic. I don't think symbiosis is the right word for it. Maybe. A symbiotic relationship emerged where dogs provided some level of protection, guard dogs, and assisted in the hunt. And humans grew to love them because the humans that did were more likely to survive. And thus, man's best friend. The story of cats is actually quite funny. They're an invasive species that humans tolerate. Why? They have big eyes that remind us of babies. Apparently, that's what they say. Take a look at these stories, and you can see this poor image of this dog. That sad face. And then you start to realize that, while I certainly think animal cruelty is wrong across the board, if I'm going to eat one of my chickens, it is going to be put out of its misery very, very quickly without realizing what's happening. And I'm sad. I don't like to end life, but I also understand as a person, a human who eats, this is what you do. And there are people who go to the store and they don't realize what they're eating. You're eating life. Something was alive. It's dead now, and you consume it. That's the circle of life. To improve the lives of humans, there are many people who have found it easy to do the experimentations on dogs. As I mentioned, sometimes maybe it has to be on dogs for certain things. I don't like the idea. Locked in a small cage, subjected to procedures that impose extreme pain and suffering, but I don't let emotion dominate my worldview. And that means there's kind of a conundrum here. If you are dominated by logic, you would be no different than those awful scientists breaking off someone's arm and freezing it. You don't care about the individual. You don't care about their life. If you're dominated by emotion, you would sacrifice the potential for gain and the improvement and protection of individuals because everything is wrong all the time. Not only that, but as an overly emotional being, you might actually become violent and dangerous like a lot of the woke people are. The truth is, there's a healthy balance. Recognizing that we do have to do some brutal experimentation and recognizing where that line is and what we're willing to accept. It's not easy. A lot of people don't realize they benefit from some of the most brutal experimentation possible. Notably, the production of standard medications. I think it's like aspirin and acetaminophen and ibuprofen. I think they use fetal cell tissue to make these products or to test them or whatever. What I do know is it's been widely reported as people claim they won't get the vaccine because they used fetal cells in the testing of it from aborted fetuses. These organizations come out and say, so all these other medications do too. But here's what you realize. A lot of these people say, wow, I didn't know that. I guess I won't take aspirin anymore. That's the important point. The view from the establishment left is that anybody who didn't already know and finds out now is a hypocrite. I think a lot of people who are finding out what's going on right now are changing their view of things. And that goes along with Fauci and his dogs. I can't imagine that this group going after Fauci is a right-wing group for animal rights. But certainly the right is now ready to understand just how brutal and awful these practices are. And it may have been Fauci who led them there. All in all, probably a good thing. They mentioned in the Intercept report, according to U.S. Department of Agriculture's aptly named animal usage report, 60,979 dogs were used in the U.S. for experimentation in 2016 alone. The reported number of all animals used for experimentation, whose reporting was required, was 820,000. It's an interesting conundrum. So 183,000 guinea pigs, 139,000 rabbits, 102,000 hamsters, 71,000 non-human primates, 60,000 dogs, 50,000 pigs, 18,000 cats, 12,000 sheep, 161,000 other covered species. It's tough, isn't it? It's really tough. We think about the moral injustice of slavery, taking a person and taking away their will, their free will, their rights. Wrong. Now we have people who argue that killing animals for food is the same thing. Now this I disagree with. I certainly think that animals do also have rights. I wouldn't necessarily say they have the same rights as people, but there's certain rights. I mean, animal cruelty is wrong for a reason. Some animals have some rights. I certainly think so. Because I believe rights are part of natural law. Anyway, I digress. Some animals do. And then we get to the question of, are we to use them in to experiment on to better ourselves? And you have to be somewhat cold a little bit. I don't think people want to recognize this, but I'm not going to play emotional games with people just because Fauci is a dickhead. You know, he's a liar. He's wrong all the time. He's awful. But I'm not going to blame him for the fact that he signed off on funding for what's been going on forever. I certainly think it is bad, but there are very serious questions you need to ask yourself. Like the founder of, not the founder, it was like the high-ranking person at PETA, diabetic, getting insulin derived from pigs. And many people called this person out as a hypocrite. Why should you be allowed to harvest the insulin from pigs, kill them in the process, assuming they do, harm them, cage them, but then demand other people can't have pets, can't have a dog, can't have a cat? Hypocrisy. And the response is, I'm more effective this way. That's always the answer, isn't it? But these are the questions that people need to ask themselves. Do you really want to know how the sausage is made? Because once you find out, you might not want to participate in that anymore. It's brutal questions. When you realize that around the world, slavery still exists. When you realize that no matter where you are, all of these great things you're getting, these technological developments, partly include in many ways aborted fetal cell tissue in animals, dogs. If it was you, could you pull the trigger? Probably not. You know, a lot of these people who grow up in cities have become so weak they couldn't shoot an animal to eat it. They'd be, no, I can't do it. I can't kill it. It's good in some ways. Me, I've never been like that for whatever reason, even growing up in a city. I don't want to hurt any animal. And I hope I never have to. But when it comes to raising livestock to consume, you do. You do. And it's an important lesson for kids. Do you want to know where the chicken nuggets you eat come from? When you go to the store and we get a chicken sandwich, when you get a cheeseburger, these kids need to understand what they're doing. They don't. I love that. I had a steak for breakfast. It was great. Local farm sirloin. Delicious. Lightly seasoned. And as I was eating it, I was reminded of that story on Twitter where these people were like, wait a minute, you mean steaks are made of muscle? And they're all like, I thought meat was just like the meat. What? What are you thinking? It's muscle. You're not eating tongue or intestine. What do you think you're eating? Just meat. You think like animals are just made of like raw steak walking around? There's like no heart or anything? Like animals carry with them just this rich proteiny material that does nothing for their bodies? It's muscle. These people don't know that. So look, you want to arrest Fauci, you want to throw him out? By all means. I'm not a fan of this stuff, but I hope you take a look into these factors and see how the sausage gets made, because then you might be like, wow, there's a lot more people involved in this. I'll leave it there. Next segment's coming up at 4 p.m. over at youtube.com/Timcast. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you all then.